traditional rail fence has 3 colors: a light, a medium, and a dark fabric. They can be all of the same color, a light, medium, dark, and blue, light, medium, dark, and red, or they can be 3 different colors but have a light value, a medium value, and a dark value. For this quilt that I'm showing you today, I decided to do 9 colors because that's what I had available, and I had some already pre-cut. And my strips were already pre-cut at 3 inches, so they should have finished at 2.5. So you can see here, I've already sewn 2 strips together. And now I'm preparing to sew the 3rd strip to this set. And I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's not a race. Just being careful to hold my fabric to maintain that seam allowance, that 1/4 inch. And now I'm going to feed through 2 more strips. That's called assembly line sewing. When you feed another set of strips after another set, it saves on thread. I'm just continuing to sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just adjusting as I go. I don't use pins for this. If you feel more comfortable using pins, by all means. But since I don't use pins, I just adjust it along the way. Now, before I press the seams in one direction, what I'm doing is, this is called setting the seam. And for all of you new quilters, all that means is you're going to hit that seam with heat, and that heat will help set the seam. That heat will help set the seam so that if there were any little loose threads or anything, that helps keep everything in place. Now, this is the first technique. There's a couple different ways you can press strips. You can do it this way first, where you press the wrong side, all the seams going in one direction. Then turn it over, and being very careful, lift up your iron and press it section by section. And in this way, you're not distorting how straight that strip is. But please be careful. The steam iron is very hot. I have burned myself. So So again, I'm hitting each seam with heat to set the seam. But this time I'm going to show you the second method of pressing seams to one direction. So this method, you start from the top and you finger press it first with your fingers, and then you hit it with the iron. Now, when you do it this way, you have to be very careful not to burn your hands and your fingers. It requires a little bit more finagling than the other method where you press the wrong side first and then flip it over and do the right side. It just depends on what your preference is. And again, I'm lifting the iron and gently pressing. Pressing means lifting and moving gently, and then you lift and move gently. It's not ironing where you're actually stroking the fabric with the iron back and forth. Pressing is much different. Before I cut my squares, what I'm doing is I'm measuring the width. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 inches. Now I'm going to grab another strip and I'm going to measure this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 inches. If I've done an accurate quarter seam allowance, this should be 8 inches. Okay, time to start cutting. This first cut, you're going to cut about 9.5 inches because you want to make sure that you cut off that selvage, that raw edge on the end. So that first cut, you have to cut once and then turn it around and then measure it exactly 8 inches and then straighten that edge that's uneven. Now you can continue to cut the rest of the strip at 8 inches cut, because that square, once it's sewn into the quilt, will be finished at 7.5 inches. And if I've done an accurate quarter-inch seam allowance, it should match my written measurements. Sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't, that's okay. You always want to measure your strip set to find out what that cut has to be. Mine's 8 inches because it's going to finish at 7.5. It could have very easily been 7 7/4 or 8 1/4. If so, you have to cut your square according to what that strip width is. There we go. I got 5 square rail fence cuts out of 1 strip set. And now I'm going to start the next color. Take my first cut, which is going to be greater than 8 inches because I need to square up that first cut because the end is always uneven and you don't want any selvage in there. Now I'm going to show you a different technique for cutting. In this type of cutting, you get twice as many cuts done in the same amount of time. So what I'm doing is I'm layering 2 strips together, right sides facing, and I'm making sure that those seams are nesting. And you can see here where I've made sure that those seams are nesting. And now I'm going to take my first cut, which is going to be, like I said, about 9.5 inches. And now I'm going to turn it very carefully. And now I'm going to make the finish cut to square it up at 8 inches. And there you have it. 2 cuts in the time it takes to do 1. So for you new quilters, this is another technique to get quilting done a little bit quicker. And this works well with strip sets. Just make sure that after 2 or 3 cuts, you make sure that those seams are lining up and nesting. And for you new quilters, just notice how after I make sure that my ruler is lined up, my hand that's holding the ruler is in that spider position. And it's difficult to see, but as soon as I put that rotary blade down, I shift it into the safety position. Start your good habits now so that you always have that good habit. There. So if you have a rail fence like this one, like one of the blocks that I've done for this quilt, I have 3 rails, cut 3 inches, finish at 2.5. Now it should be a light, a medium, and a dark. This particular strip does not have a high contrast in value. And I basically chose them because I thought they complemented each other, not necessarily because there was high contrast in value. And I thought they looked interesting. This is the other set that I'm doing in this particular quilt. And this one you can see more of the value, the light, the medium, and the dark. And again, I chose these 3 because I thought the patterns looked interesting together. Here is the last strip set that I created for this block. And you can see here, again, a light, a medium value, and a dark. Now within these values, there's light and a little bit of medium. And within this one, it's medium with different shades of dark and different shades of light. But I thought they transitioned well, and I liked the way these strips made the block more interesting. I wanted this particular rail fence to not be a traditional one, but more of a non-traditional rail fence. Now I have to decide which layout, and I'm going to be showing you the layouts here soon. So this is the first layout I'm considering, and you can see here where the way it's laid out, each block forms sort of a pinwheel. And this would end up being a very square quilt, and a little bit smaller, actually. This next one is a traditional layout where I have 2 of the same color variations next to each other to create this ladder effect. And this is one option. This is the third option where I have 3 of the same colors next to each other to create the ladder effect, which is more of a traditional layout. And I think I'm going to go with this layout. Yes, I think I like this one because it's a rectangular shape, and this particular layout, it uses up most of the blocks. And now I'd like to show you some examples of some rail fence patterns. This one comes from Quick Quilts. This is the March 2008 issue. It's one of my vintage quilt magazines. And you can see here, this design is more of a primitive design. It's a rag quilt where the seams are showing, they're not enclosed. And the pattern itself has one rail fence alternating with a folk art applique moon and star. So here you can get an idea of different types of layouts and different types of ideas on how to do a rail fence. This next vintage pattern is 101 Quick and Easy Quilt Patterns. This is 1990. And as you can see on the back, it shows a black and white layout of a rail fence. And this particular rail fence has 4 bars, a light medium, a medium dark, and a dark. And this is a traditional layout with a standard border. This pattern goes on to say that there's 30 16-inch blocks. There's 6 rows of 5 blocks across, and there's an 8-inch border. So this particular quilt ends up being 96 inches by 102. It's a fairly large block. But I can't imagine it would take very long, because that's a 16-inch block. That's a fairly large block. The next pattern book I'm going to show you is titled Lap Quilting with Georgia Bone Steel. And it says here that there's over 70 traditional designs and projects to piece by machine and quilt on your lap. This section gives you instructions on how to put the strips together, what the seam allowance should be, and what the finished size should be. In the beginning of the book, it gives a larger image of the block. And it explains that in the back of the book there's one template, and it's the rectangle. And you'll need 8 dark rectangles and 8 light rectangles to achieve this block. Now you have to understand, they weren't doing a lot of strip piecing back then. Well, did you enjoy this video? You know what to do. Give it a thumbs up. Helps with the algorithm. Subscribe. This way you can follow this quilt top as I finish it, quilt it, and have it all ready for the next person. And you can keep up with the other quilt tops I've been creating, like the reproduction of my vintage tulip quilt and the quilt tops that I'm making for my great nephews and my great niece. I've enjoyed this very much, sharing, caring, and creating with you. And I hope you liked that little bit at the end where I showed some vintage patterns out of a book, a magazine, and a pattern. See you next time. I'm Angela Davis, and I am the 4 AM Quilter. You know what to do.